technically counts, right? And Ireland and some other places. But anyway, it looks good to pad the resume and LinkedIn. So as she mentioned, this is healing-centered engagement, a new approach, a new framework. And the things and some of the topics we're going to go over today also like kind of move into some trauma-informed care aspects, but really, like my thought about these is like, how do they apply when we're doing the work and the supervision with peers, and then also to be able to give them kind of a good foundation to think about this work in their own lives, and then the lives that they go out and impact themselves. So Helios Recovery Services, I mean, we really focus on training leaders and helping folks that are new in mental health or substance use recovery and getting them trained up so that they can go out and serve folks, right? That's always been like a field and an area that I really like training in. When I worked for Harmony Cafe and Goodwill, I'd go and teach college students, and I would always just think like, who are the thousands of people potentially they're going to go impact, right? And hopefully through the course of some of the training that I did, like there were some seeds planted, right, that grew and developed into what they needed to be later on in life. But just to be able to give them, some good kind of opportunity. So we think the same thing with folks brand new in their recovery journey, whatever that may be. How do they get what I believe are some of these key elements of servant leadership, cultural humility, emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and then of course what we hear today to talk about healing-centered engagement. I don't view these as silos or columns, but more like interwoven kind of things that kind of support each other in a lot of different ways. So again, like as we think about all this, what other stuff can we incorporate into it, and how can we support the folks that we're working with? And also, I'm really open to if people have questions, feel free to raise your digital hand. I should be able to see most of those, or your literal hand. I think I can see everyone on the screen so far, or if you want to type in the chat box, I'm going to try to stay aware of that as well. In fact, I'll be able to bring it on one screen here if you give me one moment. It's that way, because I like interactive conversations. And I'm also just in full-on training mode. I just got done with 2 days of ethical considerations for recovery coaches, and so it was very back and forth. Again, Jesse Heffernan, he, him, his pronouns, training advocacy consulting with Helios Recovery Services, and you'll get all that as well. Some of the takeaways from today: difference between healing-centered and trauma-informed approaches, and 3 ways to improve strategies and outcomes, right? And again, practical application for some of the folks that we might be working with directly or through leadership standpoints. A little bit more background. So when I was at the Iris Place, which is at the time, it was one of Wisconsin's 3 peer-run respite centers in Wisconsin. And they based their model off of, AFIA and Western Massachusetts Learning Center. We had guests come in and experience what peer services were. It was a completely voluntary system. Now Wisconsin, I think, has 5 or 6. One of them is veteran-specific peer-run respites. So, my work there, overseeing peers, and in my work with Faces and Voices, working with coaches and peers and training them is really where some of this comes from. And again, I'm open to questions, comments, thoughts. If folks have approaches that they want to share, please do so. I like to rely on the expertise in the room as well. So there's a number of ways to say this, but I really like this one when it comes to creating a space where we can learn and grow and thrive. I'd like to think and assume, and this may be inappropriate, but here we are, that everyone's in a safe place where they're at right now, at least physically, to be able to watch this conversation, right, and to participate in a training. That said, if that's the baseline, I invite folks into what I call like this courageous space, right? So encouraging dialogue, recognizing difference, holding each person accountable to do the work of sharing experiences and come to new understandings. And this is, again, kind of like that bigger, broader working space or safe space or whatever terminology you may have used in the past. Again, I want to be able to foster that dialogue and that connection and that conversation between all of us as we move forward. Is there anything else folks need? If you want to type in the chat box or raise your hand, or you're like, you know what, there's just an element of this that's really important to me, that I need to be here to be fully present in this space before we move forward. Yeah, the statement about creating courage space. Yeah. Again, it's my hope that folks are, here to like it's not just about like staying comfortable. Like I think that especially in the peer space, like we're kind of pushing and promoting ourselves to move where we need to move and grow with this whole thing. And one of the bolder statements I've come to land on probably in the last 6 months is that I fully believe that the peer and coaching space will be the largest provider of recovery support services in the next 3 to 5 years, right? The recovery support field is going to overshadow therapy, counseling, what have you, prevention spaces, right? In Wisconsin alone, we've got over 1,100 certified peer specialists and probably just as many folks that have gone through recovery coach training. And so I know that's exponentially growing in every state. As we look forward, I do a lot of work within Illinois, and I know that they're training folks is a lot too. So part of this work and this advocacy is like, how do we again support them, and then how also do we create space for peers to really participate, in this process of being led and being supported inside their organization. So folks familiar with trauma-informed care? Yes, no, maybe. This is brand new, Jesse. What's this? And that's okay too, right? Trauma-informed care. It's the piece I think about first when I hear that. And if folks got other statements too, if they want to share them in the chat box or raise their hand, again, that'd be great. Like if like the 5 key elements of trauma-informed care, that's cool. You want to put those in. I remember one of the first times I heard it, this idea of shifting our thought process from like what's wrong with you to what happened to you, right? So it was really like, I experienced things growing up, and I'd act out a certain way, or I'd be in some kind of trouble, and inevitably the questions were like, well, what's wrong with you? Why can't you just act like other kids? Why can't you just do what other people do and get your stuff together, without really understanding the complexities or the reasons why those behaviors may have been happening, right? And then one day, someone said, well, what if it's about what happened to the person? And what if we explore that a little bit more? And then we come up with some things around this, right? We come up with these ACEs, and we say, when people experience 1, 2, 5, 6 of these things, right, there's some things that might happen in their life, right? Mental health, substance use disorder, suicide attempts or completions, right? We know that the higher score isn't necessarily one that you want to have, right? But this is where we've kind of led, for a long time now, and it's served a really good purpose, right? Trauma-informed care has helped open the door to better understanding where folks are coming from. And I would say too, like, from a direct service provider standpoint, it's really helped them help people work through things and what's going on. So it's not so much like, shame and blame kind of a thing. And then also like hospital systems and other provider systems are like, they now consider themselves trauma informed, if you will, right? So they're asking a lot more questions, and they're doing a lot more things because they just don't know what people are walking in with when they walk into their doors, right? And it's important for them to be able to know those things. And just like we've seen with other medical conditions and other medical kind of movements, like let's assume that there is some there, and then as we get to know someone, we find out there's not. Well, that's okay. We're going to treat everyone kind of like this way, kind of like when we started saying like we should wash our hands before we do medical procedures or put gloves on, right? Just these things we look back at now and we're like, oh, there was a time we weren't doing that. Same things kind of come about with trauma-informed care, right? We're seeing more folks at least say that they've gone through the trainings for these things, right? So for those of you who guessed at home, right, the 5 components of trauma-informed care, and these feel really good: safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, empowerment, right? And as we move more into the healing-centered engagement aspect of this training, it's not to say that these things are by any means wrong or even outdated for that matter, but can we provide ourselves with a different framework as to how to address trauma and how to look at it, not so much in a vacuum or a deficit-based lens, right? So before we jump into HCE, there's one thing I wanted to share with you that was pretty inspiring for me and kind of shook me up in a lot of ways. So as I said, I'm a person in substance use and mental health recovery for a little over 21 years, which means like I still go to therapy, right? Like I'm still unpacking stuff. And my therapist once upon a time, because I've been going for a while, and I'm like, why I feel like I've taken care of all these issues, right? Like I've done the work, right? I've done the deep internal work. I've gone where I think I need to go. Why does it still feel like the world's on fire sometimes? Why does it still feel like stuff's going on, right? And so my therapist had gone to this conference and learned about something called the trauma absences, which I think really spoke to what that feeling and what that experience is, right? And so some of these things like failure to protect, attune, choose, and stay, they're very real things that happen to folks on a regular basis, but because of other more acute traumas, it might be felt at higher levels, right? So these are the things that I think of as just like fan noise, like constantly going on, or if there's been one of these situations that happened, like a failure to attune and protect, and we'll dive into these a little bit more, they may feel it even more than someone who hasn't had some of those more complex traumatic things happen in their life, right? And this is just purely information. Like I'm not a psychiatrist or anything like that. These things were just really fascinating to me because as a supervisor and as a peer, like I'm constantly wanting to remain curious about the individuals that I'm working with, right? And the folks that I'm leading. And so this just helps me get more information, right? Not necessarily to diagnose, but more information to like provide resources, referrals, and, get them the help that they need, if you will. So I'm gonna go through these. And again, like if folks got comments or questions, feel free to stop me at any time. I'm gonna take a small pause right now and see if there's anything before we go forward. I think that was a good pause. All right, failure to protect. So again, these are like about the messages that folks, pick up based on things that happen in their life, right? And I can just share my experiences with you, right? So, my ACEs score, like things happen, right? There were things that I look back at now, and I wonder, like, where were the people that were supposed to protect me at the time, right? And they didn't. Maybe very intentionally didn't, maybe because they had their own trauma and they didn't, maybe because they just couldn't pick up on whatever it was that was happening to me at the time, right? But because of those things and the other things that happened to it, some messages got created, right? I don't deserve to be taken care of, or I have to handle this on my own, right? And so then I think about, how did that continue to play out in life, right? How did that continue to play out in my relationships with others, in my work life, if you will, right? Like, if I don't deserve to be taken care of, well, then I'm going to neglect my own needs. I'm going to go on the back burner. I've also been going through unpacking like there's a lot of like fundamentalist belief systems that I grew up with and what that means, and in recovery from those in a sense too. And it's interesting how much of these really align for me and mesh together throughout all of that. Or I have to handle danger on my own. So again, like I have to be on the defense all the time. So some of the things to think about too is like, do we see these in the folks, or especially like from the supervisor standpoint, do we see, behaviors, or do we see attitudes, or do we see different stories that are playing out, like, with the folks that we work with? And some of these things, again, just might provide us with information, because the other side of these messages is like, well, what messages do I need to replace them? Or what affirmations do I need to replace them? And as a leader, what affirmations can I offer individuals, right? Like, this is the place where you are taken care of. This is the place where you don't have to handle danger on your own, right? At least when it comes to the workplace environment. I'm not trying to fix or, do anything for anyone, but I can at least offer them safety in these realms if I feel like some of these things are coming up, right? Thoughts, comments? All right, failure to attune. I pretend to be someone, so you like me. I don't let myself feel my needs, the false self, right? So attunement, largely important in the peer world, right? Meeting people where they're at, treating them like experts of their own experience, treating them as resources, right? This is all great stuff. Thank you so much. So when I was in middle school, I didn't do very well in school. I had a difficult time concentrating, behaving, all the things, getting grades, right? And I had what in my state or county, they have what's called like a big pal. It's kind of like big brothers, big sisters. And this guy was, he had some money, right? So he would come in with the carrot, right? And say, if you get some good grades, where do you want to go? What do you want to do? Right? What do you want to be like, I'll take you anywhere you want to go. And as like a seventh grader, I was like, oh, this is amazing, right? Gonna go to Disney World or a Cowboys game. I really was into sports ball at the time. So I had this wish list of things I would do. And honestly, for 2 weeks, like I did really well, right? Got my homework done, so on and so forth, but it only lasted so long because I couldn't really understand what that meant, something that far out, right? And it was interesting because I still am in contact with that person, and we met like a couple of years ago, and he did kind of the same thing when I was talking to him about my business. He's like, if you can do this, I'll give you this. And I stopped and I was just like, that's not what I need in this, right? And as a seventh grader, I didn't need this carrot. I needed a tutor to come and meet me every single night, to sit down with me one-on-one, right? So when we talk about this attunement piece, right? And if we're seeing things, it's like that. If you've ever seen that cartoon, and there's a teacher at a desk, and then you've got like this array of animals. There's like a fish, giraffe, a hippo, and a monkey. And the teacher says, like, your job is to get up that tree in like 2 minutes, right? And of course, a number of those animals, it's not going to happen for them, right? But that's the expectation that's put on them. So I think there's a certain level of attunement where people will, and myself included, will shift to who I think I need to be, or try to fit into what needs to be happening. Won't allow myself to feel my own needs because I want to, be in that place where someone's seeing me and doing what I need to do, right? So attunement, again, what is the messages that I can tell myself? I can take care of myself, my own needs. I can ask for what I need, right? And then also with people that I work with, what is it that you need to be successful? What is it that you need that we can move and do different things with, right? Now, granted, there's a lot of stuff you just got to do at work, right? We've got administrative, we got so on and so forth, right? But we can also still look at the skills and look at the areas where folks want to be developed and help learn what those are from them, right? I'd like to have access to these slides, great information. What else do we got? Great stuff. I feel a shift coming. Oh, shift happens. I love that, right? I'm sure someone already made that bumper sticker. Failure to choose. So, in this context, individuals, not being chosen, and a lot of this is like parental or parent or caregiver roles, right? Like choosing something over the individual, right? And again, this might happen to folks on a regular basis. Some of these things are what build resilience. Like we're like, oh, that person chose this over me. Clearly, that's not a healthy relationship. I should probably find somewhere else to go. But in some cases, again, like it's kind of like it seeps in a little bit deeper for various reasons, right? So like a parent or caregiver, someone like choosing substances or choosing job or choosing, hobby or something else, right, over the individual. So I'm unworthy, I'm less important than what you've chosen, right? Self-doubt, right? And so again, like how do we kind of rebuild some of those messages when that's what we've heard for so long, or when that's what an individual has heard for so long? And how do they feel seen? How do they feel chosen? And if you're familiar with like languages of love and different types of things like that, like all that's attunement and re-messaging to me, right? About like how to connect with those individuals. Neurodiverse brains experience, yeah, this is structured environments all the time, including the workplace. Yeah, so neurodiversity, and again, like the responsibility for these things and the responsibility for understanding this stuff isn't on the individual to teach me about, right? As a supervisor, it's my job to learn and understand what's going on with my staff or the supervision or whatever the case may be, right? And I can't be all things to all people, but I can certainly find the resources, to develop and continue that attunement. And then failure to stay, I'm not enough, wasn't worth sticking around for, self-abandonment, right? And this one for me, I had a dad who took off, right? Decided not to be a part of the life. And those were a lot of those stories, right? And they continue to be a lot of those stories well into, adult life and coming into recovery and having to, realign some of these messages. And so again, it was easy to think some of this stuff, right? It was easy to be able to detach from individuals very easily because I would do it before they would, kind of a thing, And so the messages I had to learn about, like, I'm still here for me, right? And the things that the consistency and the stability that I can provide on a professional level, and whatever that looks like, right, for individuals, like these things might come up for them. And again, like, I don't want to replace any of the stuff they may have done or have gone through, but can I lead them to places or affirmations or things that might be helpful for them, right? Especially if any of this stuff is impacting their work as peers. Thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, opinions, sarcastic remarks? I'll take them all. Okay. Hearing none. So I think this comment really aligns with a lot of the work peers and coaches do, right? Willa Watson, doing work in Africa with young women, and and the aid that was brought in, and again, there's this with substance use and mental health, right? There can be these very paternalizing organizations that want to come in and be like, we can help you. And the same thing with Black, Indigenous, persons of colors communities, LGBTQ communities. Like, folks want to come in with privilege, power, and means and say, like, we got this, we know what's best, we have the evidence-based practices, right? You just got to do X, Y, and Z. And then if it doesn't work, well, that's on you. Why didn't you listen, right? And again, like, time after time, we've not seen those things work out very well, right? In a lot of different communities. And the same thing with, like, evidence-based practices, right? I really have just come to question that whole terminology. Like, who was the study conducted by, and what power and privilege and means did they have? Who had access to the study to be a part of it, and what power and privilege and means and access did they have to be a part of it? Was it really peer reviewed? Was it really tried out in multiple and diverse communities? Or was it just the ones that, like, you could get it to that would help affirm your evidence-based curriculum, right? So I think sometimes evidence-based curriculum is more just like, you've got a bigger ball of spaghetti noodles and maybe 2 noodles might stick against the wall as opposed to 1, right? And we know that peer-based services are more like promise-based. And we're starting to see different structures and groups and companies say that, like, peer-based services is malleable enough to really be able to attune and fit the needs of communities, as opposed to just saying it's this evidence-based thing that happens everywhere, right? And so I really like this. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because our liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together, right? And I've heard so many times in the last 10, 15 years, especially when we've talked about the opioid crisis, right? People say, like, well, addiction doesn't discriminate and it affects all people, but we're going to help those people over there, right? And it's like, nope, you just said it impacts all people, and that's more accurate, right? It does. It has a ripple effect. There's ballpark, like, what did they say recently? 21 million Americans impacted by substance use disorder, and whatever those qualifiers are, right? So in reality, we're saying more like there's 80 million people when you include families, and then, like, 150 million when you include workplaces and environments and communities, right? So you really got to take that bigger lens and see that it is all interconnected, and that substance use disorder and mental health don't live on their own. It's also connected with, prison industrial complexes and treatment industrial complexes and suicide prevention and those types of pieces too, right? And then you look at, housing and other quality of life issues. To me, it's this whole connected web of all these different things, right? And for me, it's like trying not to get overwhelmed by all that, but just try to stay in my lane and do the best I can. But we're here, we're providers, we care. It's hard to say no sometimes. At least for me, I'll use myself as an example. Any thoughts or comments before we move forward? Reflections, stories, anecdotes? I think I'm giving it the appropriate amount of like Zoom pause, because sometimes I know it's lagging. And like, I'm in Appleton, Wisconsin, so Appleton internet maybe isn't the fastest. I don't know. Could be a lot of things. All right, so we're going to go into healing centered engagement. The context for this comes from an article written in 2018 from Dr. Sean Ginwright, who is the executive director of the Flourish Agenda. I use this material with permission from them. Dr. Ginwright wrote this specifically in his work that he does with young Black men in Oakland, California, and Flourish Agenda there. And the work, and so I went on to do the full class. It was like it's a 7-module, 26 hours to become a healing centered engagement practitioner. None of that stuff is really in here. This is, again, really based off the article, just to kind of give you an idea of the framework. And I still think it does the whole piece good justice. And then the practitioner course itself is far more in depth. I was working with this group in Duluth, Minnesota called Lifehouse, and they provide a lot of youth serving practices, and a number of their staff went through it as well. And so, like, again, it's great as a staff piece. So again, I'm going to provide some of this. And again, think about, how does this apply to your practice? How does this apply to your organization? How do we redevelop some frameworks in the way that we're addressing issues within our communities and with our staff and with our own organizations as well? So trauma-informed care, it's an important lens, right? People have been harmed, but it presumes that the trauma is an individual experience rather than a collective one, right? It's still like it happened to me, right? It didn't happen to us, it happened to me, kind of a thing. And again, like, I know there's different variations of this in communities. I can say, like, oh, well, there are communities and there are groups of people that say, like, we've collectively experienced trauma. And I think this is coming more from the trauma-informed approach and saying, like, well, it's addressed individually, right? It's very rarely addressed collectively in the sense of what healing centered engagement is providing. And again, if folks got pushback or feedback or thoughts about this, feel free to chime in with those. Oops. Again, little insight as to how we address the root causes of trauma in neighborhoods, families, and schools. And it focuses on treatment of pathology rather than fostering the possibility of well-being. And so in the recovery coach work I do, we talk about coaches being individuals, anyone interested in promoting recovery and helping people find their pathway. And we say it's our job to focus on a person's potential, not their pathology, right? Again, I focus on a person's potential, not their pathology. And that's like person first language and meeting the person where they're at, supporting multiple pathways of recovery. And trauma informed still focuses on what? The trauma, right? It's still a deficit-based terminology, right? Which, great, there's places and areas in fields that address those things, and that's what they do really well, and they're just as needed. But for me as a coach and a peer, and like when I read this article originally, I felt like, what did someone say, a shift coming? I felt my whole, like, every fiber of my body shift. I'm like, this is what coaching and peer work is, healing centered engagement, right? Not trauma-informed care. I could easily justify that all the trainings I do meet the 5 components of trauma-informed care, and people like that because it's evidence-based. But here we are, I think, really trying to shift into this new framework, right? And these are, again, like, this is pulled from the article, but absence of disease doesn't constitute health, right? Just because that's gone doesn't mean things are necessarily good, right? Absence of violence doesn't constitute peace. Reduction of pathology doesn't constitute well-being. Thoughts about what this means to you? I'd like to hear some folks. I've been talking a lot, and that's okay. I will continue to. But I'd like to hear if there's anyone else, what comes up for you when you see these statements.
I'll comment.
Sure.
What comes up for me is that I think this is already my point of view. I just needed validation. And I think as a peer, that's what I do. Like, I don't know, I've been accused of being optimistic. Um, and that can be, you know, problematic in itself, but I think that is kind of that shift. I mean, having optimism is like you said, like focusing on not just someone's, but just focusing on potential in general, rather than focusing on trauma. And it feels like the next step. So gosh, this is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Other thoughts, comments? What comes up for you from this or from some of the previous slides?
I also want to say that I work in a clinical setting, and I just want to bring this to my clinicians. Like I like super like next meeting together, hey guys, like just like interject and like make them listen.
Yeah.
I'm the only peer, which I'm sure a lot of people experience.
Yeah. And that's a whole other conversation. What's it like to be the peer in the clinical setting? And that's a whole conference itself. Any other thoughts? I like the statement. What comes up is that this is a refreshing new way and thinking of approach. Great. So healing-centered engagement expands, you know, how we think about responses to trauma, and it looks at a more holistic approach, right? Fostering well-being, involving culture, spirituality, civic action, and collective healing. So to me, part of the recovery process isn't just stop doing drugs or get my mental health stuff under control, right? That's symptomatic. Those are the symptoms of the greater thing happening. And if those symptoms happen to return, like I'm abandoning the word relapse. I'm like, it's a reoccurrence of symptoms, right? And I really love talking to like folks in the substance use disorder field, because there's still like this really, you know, punitive lens of addicts, right? And like, if you relapse, maybe some time in jail will make you feel better, right? And I say, well, what if someone has a reoccurrence of depression? Are you going to give them some jail time to get over that? Or what if someone has a diabetic, has a reoccurrence, and they eat a candy bar? Are we going to have a surprise party intervention and tell them we don't love you anymore if you don't stop eating candy bars? Like, no, of course not. We're going to say like, oh, there was a return in that, and we want to address that, and we want to talk about how we can support you so that doesn't happen anymore, because we care about you and we love you and we want those symptoms to not impact your life anymore, right? And I've been to a few surprise party interventions, and I absolutely refuse to go to any more. And when I find surprise party interventionalists, I tell them, stop it. There's better ways out there. In fact, the guy, quick anecdote, the guy from A&E intervention, the dude with the big white mustache, he lives in Wisconsin, and him and I were keynoting the same conference. And he gets up there ahead of time, and I'm sorry if this frustrates people, but he gets up there and he's like, addict this, don't do that, enabling this, tough love that. And I'm like, it's like I'm sitting in a conference in the mid 90s, and this guy's just like going to town about how to punish people out of their addiction. I get up there and I'm like, that's all wrong and hasn't worked for 50 years. Clearly it hasn't worked that well, right? And I went on to share my own story about trauma and healing-centered approaches. Needless to say, he didn't come to my conversation the next day, right? He kind of beelined for the door right afterwards. And I'm like, dude, like, stop it. Like, why? I think it was like a celebrity thing. They were just happy to have him there. Okay, so HCE views trauma not simply as an individual isolated experience, but in which trauma and healing are experienced collectively. It requires, and so again, like from those questions earlier, right? We went from like, what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and healing-centered engagement says, what's right with you? Let's start there. A true strength-based approach, right? And sometimes we might say, well, the folks I work with or the people that I supervise, they don't understand or know what their own strengths are. And I say, okay, well, let's provide them with lists. Let's sit down and look at what strengths they might have. And I learned early on that skills are transferable, right? So even in my active substance use disorder, I was really good with fractions. I was really good at networking. You know, I was really good at finding a ride. like I had some skills, right? And those are all transferable, right? I just don't have to throw those out. Did someone catch the fractions? Great. I don't have to throw all those out just because that's what it was, right? There was clearly some things that weren't working very well, and some folks that I, didn't want to hang around with anymore. But there were still things and even survival mechanisms that may have served some purpose for a while, right? When I presented this, I was at a conference in Michigan talking about LGBTQ plus and addiction for providers, and I snuck in some HCE. And I had a couple folks from a treatment facility come in and say, their traditional kind of way of doing an assessment was, well, let's talk about all the stuff that happened to you, all the stuff that you did that landed you to treatment, right? So we're gonna like kind of run the gauntlet of crap that happened, right? And then at the end of it, we're gonna be like, tell us some things you like about yourself. And the person is just like, well, why, what, how do I do that, right? Because they've completely put their mind into all the things that happened, and they said they're going to switch that up. And like, tell us some things you love about yourself, that you like about yourself, hobbies, interests you had as a kid, right? And I said, well, let's go past that and say, like, maybe you're not giving the assessment, to find out all the crap they went through, but like, what are the things that have happened in your life in X amount of years that have prevented you from living that life, right? What are those things? Substance use disorder, mental health issues, trauma, so on and so forth, right? So we're not looking at it as though there's all these deficits and crap that happened, but rather these have been the things that are preventing you from living that life that maybe you had, or maybe that you want at some point, right? And help them envision those things. I really like the process, both for individuals and for organizations that I consult with, called appreciative inquiry, right? Has anybody heard of that before? It's a really great process. It kind of goes like, we've had different assessment models for organizations, strengths, opportunities, SWOT analysis, and then SOAR analysis. And this kind of fits that line too, going into appreciative inquiry and really helping people discover and dream and determine their own outcomes with things. Healing Center comes in the approach that people are not harmed in a vacuum, and well-being from participating in transforming root causes of the harm within institutions. The 4 key elements is that it's political, not clinical. It's extremely political, right? We've had to make significant changes to the peer workforce here. And sometimes when I've had to do that in Wisconsin, I've had to circumvent Department of Health Services and go right to legislators and then turn my privilege up to 11 because I got to speak for folks that are also in the room and say, this is the way we got to do things, right? And then we force DHS's hand to make some changes. It's political, just for us to be able to get peers to be medically reimbursed, right? To have cost of living, to be able to do some different things. We've had to make some movements and some stuff. And there's groups that have done it in other ways as well. But again, it's coming back to that clinical aspect. Culturally grounded, asset driven, and supports providers in their own healing. In fact, our peer-run respites here in Wisconsin are a result of like 2 or 3 years of an advocacy group going around the state, collecting information and data, learning that involuntary psychiatric care and forcing people into institutions is actually costing the state more money. And they were able to show that when people voluntarily engage in their own recovery and wellness experiences, that they don't go back to those institutions, at least for like another year or so afterwards, right? And so again, they were able to move legislation forward to get earmarked like $450,000 a year per respite, So again, we're seeing the movement, in this political sense of being able to justify and show that peer services and respites and different types of things like that work. Asset driven and supports providers in their own healing. I love that part, right? Self-care. Take care of ourselves first. I can't do this work unless I do this work, right? Before I go in here, thoughts, comments, questions? Kathy Cordova, Recovery Cafe, San Jose. Love recovery cafes. It's like 2 of my favorite things together. Good coffee and recovery. Is that from the Seattle Recovery Cafe model? I'm curious. I don't know if Kathy's typing or looking for the unmute. I've been in both spaces. All right, so political rather than clinical. So again, communities, individuals who experience trauma are also agents in restoring their own well-being. And we've seen this happen with a number of organizations, right? We've seen groups mobilize and come together, and especially like, this idea that kind of transpired in the last few years where it's like, well, we're just fighting for a place at the table, right? We just want a place at the table. And I've been at those tables, right? I've been at the tables where DHS or the state says, hey, we need people with lived experience to come give us their input. And we're going to give you decent catering, maybe some gas mileage, and like collect all this information for you basically for free. And then we're going to apply it, or at least what we want to apply to different things, to different systems throughout the state, right? And I would argue that we have our own table, right? That the peer and the coaching movement is actually larger than what most of those are. In fact, I'm really interested to see what happens. There's more groups and organizations starting to like create peer associations, and dare I say peer unions. What would happen if like, some odd 1,000 peers unionize and then started to say, these are the conditions we're going to work in and these are the laws we're going to work under, right? That would be magnificent. And I wholeheartedly encourage places to do that. Healing's found in awareness and actions that address the conditions that created the trauma in the first place. So something had to be there, right? Something had to be created in order for trauma to happen with inside of it. And it could be like family dynamics and systems. It could be people get into positions of power and these positions where they're able to access vulnerable individuals, right? Like all these different things happened. But now I can say like that I'm on this side of it as a person in recovery. I know how to go back and influence the system so that those things don't happen again, right? Or even within my own organization or supervision of peers, I can make sure that those folks aren't doing that, or there's not at least more harm being done, right? And so again, when we look at this, it's about how do we impact policies and procedures. When I talk to treatment organizations or counties that hire coaches and peers, I ask them, so coaches and peers trendy and there's a ton of money coming in for it, right? I'm like, if you're going to bring in coaches or peers to your system, what policy changes are you going to make sure that your language and to make sure that your whole system meets the criteria of authentic peer services? Not trying to take a square peg and shove it in a round hole and say like, we need to make peer services fit our stuff that we're already doing, but you have to change, right? So when I worked for Goodwill Industries, we had a conversation about bringing in more clinical services from this group we were going to absorb potentially. And Goodwill ultimately said, no, we're not going to do it, because if they would have, the entire staff of like 1,500 people would have had to have become HIPAA compliant, right? Just to have that one service. So I would say then, if an organization or a treatment or a county is going to absorb peer services, they need to become peer compliant, right? And there are practices and there are standards similar to like JCO and CARF out there that they could adhere to and start doing. So they had a peer compliant organization where it could actually fit, and just not trying to add something to pre-existing behavioral health services. Culturally grounded, culture offers shared experience, community, sense of belonging. Healing is expressed collectively. I love that part. And that's again, like why we see a lot of peer services and we see mutual aid groups and self-help groups, and I would even say like creating places where peers themselves can connect with each other because they have a very unique experience in the work that they do. And so how do we provide them the support that they need and connect with other peers? Shared by identities such as race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, all these different pieces, right? And so when we talk about what those things could look like for a peer, right, or the people that they're serving, how are we creating the groups and the collective spaces so that folks can heal with folks that look like them, right, or folks that identify with them, right? And I even go a step past that and say like, do your social media posts, do your brochures, does your staff, does your board look like the people you're serving, right? And sometimes we have to stop and be like, oh, we should probably have that conversation, right? We say that we're doing all these culturally grounded experiences, but it doesn't necessarily look like it. And I understand and know the other side of that is, well, we can't hire, there's not enough folks to hire, there's not enough folks that will engage with our experiences. So again, that's not a them problem, that's an us problem about like what we need to shift and change in order to do those things, right? Who we need to talk to, what do we need to step back and do? Well, sometimes when I talk to treatment organizations and they realize that they've had a number of people leaving their treatment and not completing 28 some odd day experiences, right? They say, well, they're non-compliant to our modality, right? And I say, well, what if we brought them in and you ask them what to do differently? What if they shared their experiences as to why they didn't stay? Right? What if they said like it was all these other obstacles or things going on in their life, and then we shifted to where they're really at, and they're like, well, they wouldn't really understand how treatment works. I'm like, they understand exactly how treatment works. They understand exactly how services work, right? And right now they're out there telling everybody else about their experience in your treatment facility or in your recovery support services facility, right? Those things spread very quickly, and it's a relationship with the community that we have to constantly readdress if we're going to provide services for them. Asset driven focuses on the well-being we want rather than the symptoms we want to suppress. Just let that sit for a minute because I love that one. Focuses on the well-being we want rather than the symptoms we want to suppress. Part of healing-centered engagement is being able to look at someone. And for me, like another great term for peer services or recovery coaching is like being a compassionate witness, right? I'm not trying to fix or change or push someone to a place. I'm just holding space for them, right? And then I'm there to help them move through what they want to move through, right? Without, manipulation or trying to make them do it, right? And so to be able to sit with someone and when they come in and I think the root and Dr. Ginwright talks about this, like the root of a lot of this is being able to look at someone and say, you're more than the worst thing that happened to you. Right. And I've said that to people. I've just said that and then full stop. Don't say anything to follow it up with it. You're more than the worst thing that happened to you. And watch what processes for the person, right? Oftentimes, when I reflect back on my own recovery journey, like all I could focus on was like the one corner of the painting where things were really messed up and screwed up, right? That's all I could see. It's all I was capable of seeing. It was all I was taught to see. But there's like a big full picture surrounding that, right? My job as coach and a peer is to help other people realize that, help them see that. And as a supervisor, I help staff see that, right? Help them see that they're more than just their job. They're more than just the thing that happened to them that got them into peer services, right? Asset driven and builds on their experiences, knowledge, skills, and curiosity. Love curiosity. Here's the fun one. Supports providers in their own healing. It's a critical factor that as providers in any work that and there's a ton of cliches, right? You got to put your own oxygen on mask first before you put on someone else's. You have to have a full cup before you can pour out, right? I would say prior to the pandemic, the level of grief and anxiety I was good with dealing with was like a 3 to 4, and then it just became like a constant 7, right? And just like all these things changed and shifted, and like services shifted, and people like there was like bad news and grief like constant and daily, right? It was, and again, like I had gotten used to like life and recovery in particular is just like constant grief. There's constantly things happening and changing, right? And then it accelerated. And there were times when the self-care met that, and there were times when the self-care didn't meet that. There were times when I wasn't sure which was which and how to do those things, right? And for me as a person in recovery, I got to make sure that for like I've got like this really close group of people. I like to think of like the people in my life as like these orbits, right? And like there's like the inner circle, like the Fab Five, right? I got the people I can go to when I need to go to for anything. And then I've got folks, other kinds of relationships and working relationships and professional relationships and so on and so forth, right? And people go in and out of those circles at varying times. And I got therapy, and I've got, gratefully, basketball's picked back up, and gratefully there's like this influx of comic book movies that are coming out, because that's great, and tons of geek stuff going on, right? So I find these things that align for me, right? And what I'm hoping is that, we can continue to find our own self-care. When I oversaw peers, I'd come into a situation where the former director was gone for like 3 or 4 months prior to me moving in, right? And so we had this staff of like 10, 12 people who, there was an executive director of the program, but it was a couple steps removed, and they were only able to check in with them once or twice. And so this whole staff kind of became like they leaned in on each other to be each other's like support systems, friends, and colleagues kind of simultaneously. They had these multifaceted relationships, right? Which, great, it served a purpose for the time, but it also could have been extremely problematic if any one of them, had difficulties or situations with each other. It shifted the paradigm inside the organization, right? And so part of my role was to like, how do we like kind of build this thing where like they're not leaning on each other as much? It wasn't to say like their roles or their relationships were bad, but we just had to reorientate what they meant, right? So part of that was saying each of them were expected to have a recovery wellness plan. I didn't need to know what was on the plan. I just needed to know that they had one and that they were working on it with someone outside the organization. Because especially if we were going to be helping people with their recovery wellness plans, I felt that it was important for me to have one, for them to have one, to be able to, really show and model some of those situations, right? And again, like over time, we just saw like they were meeting with people outside of it. They even had like friends and mentors from other respites that they worked with, right? Which was great. Again, like just relying on those folks outside of it. And we were able to untangle some of the dynamics and the relationships, inside the respite, and create more of that peer professional environment, along with being like respite, right? So again, that's the fourth component of healing centered engagement, if you will. My last slide: social change is a million acts, individual acts of kindness. Cultural change is a million subversive acts of resistance. Questions, comments, thoughts? I feel like as a professional, I should land on my slide with my contact information on it, because that's what professionals do. I didn't put that one at the end there. So, all right. Anybody? Questions, comments? Yes, Kathy?
I have to say that of all the sessions I've been to today, that I most resonated with what you had to say. Again, I'm with a Recovery Cafe, the one in San Jose. So we were the first one in California. Now we're up to 6 in California, 37 recovery cafes across the US and Canada, and growing. So, but everything you said is just so core to the work that we're doing. In particular here in San Jose, in the last year, we've been doing a lot of work with having some of our peers attend community organizing institutes, so that through other community organizing organizations, they can learn the skills to, advocate around fair housing and some of the other issues beyond simply, I don't want to say simply, but beyond just recovery issues.
Yeah. And again, recognizing that so many of those things are connected: housing, quality of life, access to food, all that stuff. And again, I agree, it's very important. And as leaders, we get to help define that scope, right? And then encourage and promote our folks into those places, like, to go and grow into those areas that are really important for them too. And also, if you ever need training or consulting in San Jose, it's like 30 some degrees here in Wisconsin. I'm not thrilled. It's like almost May and I am tired of this. Yeah. So just, we'll talk. Trenda?
Thank you, Jesse. Great presentation. So just curious, could you go back to the failure twos and just give us maybe one example of what that looks like or sounds like in the workplace?
Sure. So I think this is a good one: failure to attune, right? So I've got a staff member, right? And here's the expectations of what's going on with them. The behavior isn't matching that. And there's this process that I learned when I was at Goodwill. It's called carefrontation. They had really corny names of stuff. And it's basically like motivational interviewing, right? So it's like expectation, behavior, help me understand the difference between those things. And a lot of times when I've done that, it's learning that there's something in the environment, or there was like the way that I tried to teach the procedure or the policy that didn't align with how they understand it, right? So I've come to grow, you know, like there's audio learners, visual learners, kinetic learners, and I think that I'm a relational learner, right? I learn best when I'm learning with someone, right? And I have that experience with them. And I have found like there's a lot of folks in recovery like that, right? It's not just here's the pamphlet, figure it out. And then they don't do it, right? I'm like, oh, why didn't you do it? You're not in compliance. Whereas relationally, we can get through it together, right? So I think that's a good piece of like, especially that attunement. Okay, interesting statement about evidence-based programs. Not sure how to respond to that. If we are working for a program that is based on evidence-based practices, right? And wow, I'm not trying to throw them all under the bus. I'm trying to say I've had experience with some of them that like just feel like, again, they're trying to well-intended hit and miss impact, right? And I don't say it to say stop doing evidence-based practices. I'm saying it to have deeper conversation as to what the evidence-based practice is. When someone offers something like that to me, I say, like, let's go back a few steps and find out exactly where it came from, who conducted it, right? Who was a part of those studies and those kind of things. And there are people far smarter than I am that understand that even more in depth, right? But I think it's worthwhile having the conversation. And then before applying the evidence-based practice to a particular community group or organization, let's find out if it fits, if it's truly what attunes with the organization, or am I in this place of paternalizing and say like, well, I've got the funding, here's what the funding says I got to do, here's what's going to fit, right? So it's again, it's relationship, I think, that it really boils down to with what kind of practices we can apply to different environments.
Thank you so much.